In one sense, all media are social, and all media forms have always been social. Now, as a species, we learn to sing and to recite stories and poems in a circle around a fire as a way of forging social bonds through cultural exchange. Think about movie theaters. Movie theaters have been sites of courtship for more than a century. Films don't end as the credits roll. People continue to discuss them around offices and barbershops. Think about mail or telegrams, telephone calls, emails. All of these connect individuals to each other, each media form more conveniently than the previous. So when we refer to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or even Tinder as social media, what exactly do we mean? How are these services distinct from other, older forms of connectivity and information distribution? In other words, what's so social about social media? Well, the operative definition of social media services within the field of social media studies was pretty much established in 2008 by two researchers in the emerging field of internet studies. They were Dana Boyd and Nicole Ellison. Together they defined a social media service as a bounded system that allows people to enroll in it and construct profiles of themselves. The services will let them choose which other profiles they would like to interact with. And it would allow them to view material posted by their chosen list of profiles. Ellison and Boyd generated this broadly applicable definition when most social media services were merely websites, or static websites, before most of the activity moved to freestanding applications that run on mobile platforms like smartphones or tablets. But just as importantly, Boyd and Ellison chose not to include one of the most important aspects of the most dominant social media services around the world: algorithmic amplification. Ellison and Boyd emphasized the choices that users make to construct their profiles and to interact with select other members of a service. But as the second decade of the 21st century rolled in, it became clear that the most important relationships in social media services, such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or even the employment service LinkedIn, is that of the user to the algorithm. Users often unwittingly feed their information into a vast database. And this database contains deep and broad records of user preferences and desires and queries and patterns of interaction with other users' profiles and with sources of information and commercial service. And through mobile phones, social media platforms track movements, track our movements, our locations. And they even track our communication via text message that occurs outside of the platform itself. All of this data help the algorithms predict and even shape what a user might want to read, view, or buy. Social media services design their algorithms to feed users more of what they have habitually expressed interest in. In that way, they keep users fully engaged and offer them constant affirmation through a count of likes and comments from fellow users. Algorithms select posts that generate the most significant engagement, clicks, shares, likes, and comments, to spread them faster and farther than other posts, landing them in front of more users. This selective amplification structures the experience of using Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. It keeps people using the service. It focuses interest and limits exposure to expressions and opinions beyond what a user has long desired, and it positions advertisements effectively and efficiently right before the eyes of likely consumers. Overall, the relationship among users, data, algorithms, and advertisement is synergistic, and it's revolutionary. The rise and global scale of Facebook and other social media services is unlike any other previous media form. Now, these platforms have risen in the first 2 decades of the 21st century to dominate the global media ecosystem. By 2021, Facebook has more than 2.7 billion users, nearly 1/3 of the population of the Earth. Now, WhatsApp and Instagram, two services owned by Facebook, enjoy more than 1.5 billion users each. And WeChat, the largest social media platform in China, had at last count the loyalty of almost 1.5 billion people. Facebook has hosted content in more than 110 languages by 2020. And remember, these numbers are growing. They're growing constantly. Now, through these services, people share accounts of their lives and their desires. They share clips of videos they have made or clips of videos they've watched. They share links to articles they've written or articles they've read. And they share expressions of emotion, ranging from joy to rage. And that means that social media platforms contain and carry the content of all of the previous dominant media forms: text, recorded music, video. But more than that, social media platforms record and relate the feelings and opinions that people express about this content. So while film lives on around the water cooler, content on Facebook arrives via Facebook, and the conversation about that content remains on Facebook. Right? The water cooler is in the theater, and the audience need never leave in this case, right? To create a metaphor. Facebook and Twitter first arrived as websites designed to be used on personal computers, attached to keyboards that sat on desks. And this model worked pretty well in the early years of those services. And let's use the years 2004 through about 2010 for Facebook, 2006 through 2010 for Twitter. As they grew in North America and Western Europe, where computers and broadband connectivity were ubiquitous and affordable, they seemed designed for this kind of platform. You know, the big screen sitting on a desk with a keyboard and a mouse. But by 2010, most social media services had turned their attention to becoming chiefly mobile platforms, used mainly through telephone handsets like the iPhone. The iPhone was introduced by Apple in 2007, so that's an important date, right? 2004, Facebook is created. 2006, Twitter is created. 2007, everything changes because Apple introduces the iPhone, the first data-connected smartphone that is user-friendly and pretty dependable. You know, and of course, pretty soon, millions of people started using phones equipped with the Android operating system that was introduced by Google in 2008. So by 2011, a very important year, in 2011, the majority of Facebook usage was through mobile application rather than through the traditional website. So that changed really fast. Before 2010, almost nobody used Facebook through a mobile app on a portable device. By 2011, most use was through the mobile app itself rather than the website. That growth, that type of growth, has continued as Facebook expanded around the world and made its services available in more and more languages. So by 2018, more than 75% of Facebook usage was mobile. This shift has meant that Facebook users no longer consider Facebook a place to go at a particular time of the day. And that's how it used to be. You used to go to a place in your house or your office and log on to a place called Facebook. And we don't even think about that sort of spatiality anymore. So Facebook by 2018, or let's say since 2018 basically, has gone everywhere that users have gone around the world. That the time that Facebook would not be available to users would be infrequent, and its presence would be constant, would be ubiquitous. So what is the relationship we need to draw here, we need to understand here? The relationship between those who engage with social media platforms and the platforms themselves is complex and unlike any between or among any previous media industries and their audiences. So look, film viewers are a paying audience who are sitting for the experience of watching a film at a particular time in a particular place. Commercial television viewers are the product that stations and networks sell to advertisers. Telephone and telegram companies rely on paying customers, subscribers, to provide connections and content that make paying for the service worthwhile in the first place. But for social media companies, all of those relationships complement each other. Users work for social media platforms. Whenever we post things, text, image, video, we are creating the content of the medium. We are doing the work. We're doing the kind of work that, people at Disney would do to create a product. We create the product of Facebook or Twitter. Users are also a commodity to social media companies, right? As we provide the target for the advertisements through which these companies make money. And social media users choose the users with whom we wish to communicate. But there's one aspect of the relationship that is new to social media and absent from all of those previously dominant media forms that predate the year 2000. Social media companies engage in total surveillance of users. This surveillance, the ability to record every user's location and movement, all of their internet activity, and all of their preferences, as well as and this is really important, the pattern of interactions between and among users, right? All of that data allows these companies to map social relationships and predict which products, services, ideas, and expressions a particular user might desire. And this allows for two revolutionary aspects of commercial activity through social media platforms. Number one, they can ensure that advertisements only reach those who have expressed interest in a particular type of product or service or political candidate. Secondly, surveillance enables a revenue-generating process that has not only made Facebook into one of the most highly valuable corporations in the history of the world, it subtracts that revenue from older advertising-driven media industries such as newspapers and magazines and television and radio and broadcast. The second aspect is just as important. Data accumulation lets these companies predict which types of content are likely to generate responses from particular users, thus encouraging them to come back to the service frequently. It hooks us. It gives us constant affirmation, right? Constant affirmation. And therefore, the social in social media refers not merely to the fact that people assemble in their groups of friends and followers and they contribute almost all the content that makes these services worthwhile. No, social, the word social, properly describes the ways in which computer algorithms deploy vast collections of user-created data to forge the experience of interacting with the media services. Right? So the sociality is an aspect of our relationship with each other, and it is mined by the social media service, by a Facebook, by a Twitter, by an Instagram, and really dictates for us or influences to a large degree not only what we get to see, but with whom we tend to interact. With whom we tend to interact. This is really important. Every interaction within a social media service is governed by algorithms. These services choose what users will see, read, and with whom they will most frequently interact. Data run through algorithms dictate the terms of those experiences. And it turns out that what makes social media distinct from previous media forms is the opposite of what we usually think of as social. It's not about relationships among people. It's about relationships between people and machines. Social media are more antisocial than social. Now look, the phenomenon of social media arose in the first decades of the 21st century because of a confluence of technological, economic, and ideological forces, each of which amplified the other. The World Wide Web was conceived in the 1980s as a collection of documents linked within text and indexable by tracking relations among different terms and different pages. By the late 1990s, many of those who had contributed to the development of the World Wide Web considered ways to make it social by emphasizing connections among people rather than connections among documents. Much of this work was inspired by the work of social scientists like Stanley Milgram, who explored the small world phenomenon and posited that everyone is separated from everyone else by 6 degrees of separation. And a lot of the work was inspired by a sociologist named Mark Granovetter. He mapped relationships and described how networks of people work together. The idea of making the web social was to enhance collaborative creativity. Much of the infrastructure of the internet and many of the most impressive software projects of the 1990s had been built along what were known as open source principles. Open source meant that the computer code was open to revision by any member of the coding community. It would not be controlled by any single central company or person. But, firms could build upon open source software to engage in commercial activities. Now, this idea that dozens or hundreds of authors could do better, cleaner, more efficient, more elegant work than any single creator grew to be canonical, right? It grew to be a core belief in Silicon Valley and beyond. If networks of people could find each other and collaborate, amazing things would emerge. So many of the early developers of what would become the major social media platforms emerged from this hacker culture, one that celebrated such open source styles of development. They applied such principles easily from software to society. People, it seemed, were objects to be tagged, classified, arranged, and managed. An influential strain of psychological and social science also influenced the idea that electronic networks could bond and manage people, not just pages. People, not just pages, right? That's the key insight here. Sociologists and psychologists worked to extend some fascinating early work on the makeup of social cohesion, including the famous 6 degrees experiments of the 1960s done by Milgram and others. This work inspired popular thought about what the internet could do if people could communicate and collaborate over long distances at no marginal cost. And not coincidentally, the earliest web platforms that explicitly asked members to create a profile and choose their connections was called 6degrees.com. It debuted in 1997, but it developed no way to generate revenue, and its technical infrastructure failed as its popularity grew. The same issues condemned the next few platforms that arose in the last years of the 20th century. Platforms like LiveJournal and Asian Avenue and Black Planet and Mijente. By 2002, there was enough broad interest in social media interactions that a service called Friendster managed to generate significant attention and enrollment, only to collapse by 2008, just as MySpace and Facebook rose to dominate that industry. The Friendster collapse was the result of weak infrastructure that could not handle its rising popularity, along with a lack of any source of dependable revenue. Frustration with fake profiles and frequent service interruptions drove users in North America to MySpace and Facebook. But Friendster continued to thrive for several more years in places like the Philippines and Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Meanwhile, a Google project called Orkut grew to dominate the social media market of both Brazil and India, only to be displaced in both countries by Facebook by 2013. When MySpace launched in 2003, it was just another of dozens of social media platforms, many of which attracted venture capital investment, but few of which created sustainable revenue. MySpace differentiated itself from others by allowing users to customize the design of profiles. This appealed both to musical acts and to young people who followed those acts. Youth interest drove enrollment in MySpace into the millions and ultimately attracted Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, which purchased the service in 2005 for, I'm not making this up, $580 million. MySpace which focused heavily on young users and thus limited the extent of its network in contrast to its rivals, was pretty much worthless and out of operation by 2011. So 6 years later, it had been replaced by an insurgent that had learned from the mistakes of Friendster and MySpace. And that insurgent was Facebook. Now, Facebook started in a Harvard University dormitory in 2004 and served mainly US university students for its first 2 years of existence. Its founder, Mark Zuckerberg, resisted growing too quickly before upgrading servers and connectivity, so the services would rarely crash, even at peak usage times. By 2007, the general public could use Facebook, in English anyway. By 2010, Facebook was available in more than 20 languages. And by 2011, Facebook had spread to much of the world. Now remember I told you that 2011 was a really important year in the history of social media? Here's why. In the first few months of 2011, Western coverage of the popular uprisings in Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Syria, Libya, and Bahrain sparked an assumption, largely unsupported by evidence, that Facebook and Twitter had sparked them. Journalists in Europe and the United States assumed that, because they learned of these demonstrations through Twitter and because a small group of Egyptian expatriates gathered on a Facebook group, these services must have been essential to what were a series of complex political events throughout North Africa and the Arab world. Most analyses of these movements at the time ignored long developing tensions. They ignored labor unrest. They ignored the hard work of civic organization. They ignored the role of the Al Jazeera news network. And they ignored the role of soccer fan clubs in rallying public opposition to an array of authoritarian governments across many Arabic-speaking countries. The focus was on the new, and the new was social media. Once governments fell in Egypt and Tunisia, and let's remember, those authoritarian governments survived in most of those countries in which the uprising sprouted, the myth was sealed. The misnamed Arab Spring was allegedly a social media phenomenon. The assumption spread that Facebook and Twitter energized movements that favored democracy and free expression. They had to be the foe of the tyrant, right? Well, look, real social media research revealed a very different phenomenon. As early as 2010, researchers saw how authoritarian governments used Facebook and Twitter to monitor and surveil dissent. Facebook groups were easy to infiltrate. Many dissidents and activists urged Confederates to avoid Facebook and Twitter if they feared arrest or surveillance. By 2014, authoritarian leaders across Central and Southeast Asia had discovered that the algorithms that drive Facebook favor content that sparks strong emotions. This is great for a nationalist, for an authoritarian, for a fascist. So any content that promotes nationalism, xenophobia, racism, and other forms of bigotry travels fast and furiously across these platforms, making Facebook the best possible propaganda tool. In 2014, Narendra Modi used Facebook to drive his Hindu nationalist electoral victory in India, and soon others took note. By 2016, Facebook's targeted advertising system and algorithmic amplification contributed to the election of Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines and Donald Trump in the United States. Facebook also played a central role in the surprising victory of the Leave campaign in the referendum on the future of the United Kingdom's membership in the European Union. Also by 2016, Russia had mastered the art of using Facebook to inject divisive propaganda into democratic electorates, first in Ukraine and Estonia, and later in the United States. The Russian Facebook-driven campaign to undermine civic trust continued from 2017 well into 2019 across Europe, with significant success in Poland, in Spain, and in Italy. Meanwhile, Facebook-driven campaigns helped promote nationalist leaders rise to power in Brazil and in Indonesia. In 2019, Modi won re-election in India using Facebook and WhatsApp just as effectively as he had in 2014. Now, as social media platforms chiefly Facebook and WeChat, grow to dominate the attention of more than half of the population of the world by 2021, they have structured many social, cultural, political, and economic relationships. People have begun to purchase goods and services through these platforms. And by 2019, Facebook began developing its own encrypted currency in an effort to control and monitor and monetize even more human activity. These services became more than just media through which we share photos of children and pets. They became the operating system of our lives. Not coincidentally, awareness of and resistance to this concentrated power grew as well. Governments around the world considered measures to weaken or dismantle Facebook and its affiliate services, Instagram and WhatsApp. As Facebook fought off such proposals, its leaders invoked the specter of its only remaining competitor, WeChat. And of course invoked its close relationship with the government of the People's Republic of China. And I think we can say the same and see the same about TikTok in more recent days. The prospect for democracy remained unclear by 2021 for many reasons. The remarkable power of Facebook and WeChat are among these reasons. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that this helped. I hope that this gives something of a clearer picture of how we got this social media ecosystem. Now it's up to us to figure out how to get through it. Again, thank you very much.